Cade Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot and our Saturday book. This week, our book is just phenomenal. I can't say enough good things about this book. First of all, it's not about the Trump administration. It's historical, it's uplifting, it's encouraging, gives you hope for the indomitable human spirit. It does touch on, well, it's all about slavery and the abolitionist movement, specifically one remarkable individual who's my new hero, somebody I've never heard of. So, the name of the book, can you see that? There we go. The Fearless Benjamin Lay by Professor Marcus Rediker. Let me tell you about Professor Rediker. He's the Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh, a research fellow at the College d'Études Mondiales in Paris, and his books have won numerous awards and been translated into 14 languages. And since I struggle with part of one language, English, this is pretty impressive. He did a prize-winning documentary, Ghosts of Amistad in the Footsteps of the Rebels, about the popular memory of the 1839 Amistad Rebellion in contemporary Sierra Leone, and he lives in Pennsylvania. And this book has, let me show you how well-researched this book is. These are the notes at the back of the book. Now, don't let that scare you away. This is as far from a dry historical tome as you could possibly imagine. This story is riveting. So let's get down to it. And I apologize because it's been about 6 weeks since I read the book, and you know how my handwriting tends to disintegrate as I go along. So if I look a little befuddled. So, The Fearless Benjamin Lay. And just terminology, we're using terms that Benjamin Lay used himself, appropriate to the time period and the historical record. So, the Fearless Benjamin Lay, the Quaker dwarf who became the first revolutionary abolitionist, written in 2017. And the book begins on a scene inside of a Quaker meeting house in 1738, and I'm telling you that I want this book to be a movie. This would just be the most fabulous biopic, and this scene is epic. This scene is so remarkable it was remembered by the next generation, the children who were present the day it happened. So, Burlington, New Jersey, this Quaker meeting was like an annual big deal. This is the luminary of Quakers were attending. It's called the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, and there were many leaders of the South, friends being Quakers, and members of the Pennsylvania legislature. Now, here's a little thing that I bet a lot of people were not completely aware. I think we all know William Penn, the Quakers, and I was surprised to find out that the Quakers didn't all start out like the Quaker Oats man. We, thee, thy, and peace, love, and harmony. That's not how the Quaker religion really basically started out. That was more the second generation. The original Quakers, who took all the land in Pennsylvania and got wealthy doing it by partly farming, partly trading, were slave owners, and they owned huge numbers of slaves and huge plantations in Pennsylvania. I was really surprised by that. Maybe it's just me, but I never learned that. Benjamin Lay came into this meeting house in a greatcoat. A greatcoat's like a heavy overcoat that kind of goes to the floor almost and sort of hides everything that you're wearing underneath it. And he waited patiently in his seat to speak, apparently. And in the middle of a speech by a big shot, he stood up and ripped this coat open. And underneath it, he had on a uniform and a big sword. And this is sort of shocking because in 1660, the Quakers had made what's called a peace testimony that, you know, they were pacifists who kept slaves. So he also had, so he's got this fake uniform on. Now remember, he's a little person, he's a dwarf. And he's got this fake uniform on and this big old sword, and he takes the sword, he's holding in his hand a book, and he plunges the sword into the book, and blood apparently spurts out all over the illustrious people at this meeting. Well, the book was hollowed out, and there was a bladder of red pokeberry juice is what it was. It wasn't really blood. But he was doing political theater, which he became quite famous for. Sorry, my dog's barking because I'm making a video, you know. And my husband is probably sitting right there ignoring it, tuning it out. Apologize for that. So, what does he do? Where did the... Okay. So, he rose to talk to everybody. He took this book and plunged the sword into it. And everybody, when he threw off his coat, there was this murmur, you know, a rising crescendo of emotion. And he said in a very, the prophet thundered his judgment. This book is so great. Quote, "Thus shall God shed the blood of those persons who enslave their fellow creatures." And he raised the book above his head and plunged the sword through it. And the people in the room gasped as the red liquid gushed down his arm. Several women swooned. To the shock of all, he spattered what appeared to be blood on the heads and bodies of all these slave owners. And, well, not appropriate to say owner. No human owns another human, but in the historical context. He then went on to prophesy a dark, violent future. Quakers who failed to heal the prophet's call must expect physical, moral, and spiritual death. How can a people who profess the golden rule keep slaves? Very simple question. And in light of our reading yesterday, how can a governor, Greg Abbott, who professes Christianity, abandon desperate migrants, put them on a one-way bus to some place that is ill-equipped to help them? How can you do that? So we haven't learned, have we? Anyway, so he announces this whole, the voice of the prophet boomed over the group. And of course, you can imagine, women fainted, there was chaos in the room. And he got carried out, he got carried out by some of the men like a statue. And the comment in the book is that guerrilla theater was his thing. He often got carried out of meetings as a troublemaker. He had this reputation. They saw him coming and they were like, oh God, now what's he gonna do? So he was really into what's described as the theater of apocalyptic outrage, and he began doing it publicly in streets, in the markets, and then he carried it into the meeting houses. And as you're going to find out, he was English, and he kind of guerrilla theatered his way out of England and ended up in the colonies. There's a term called parrhesia. I'm not saying that right. I'm certain it's Greek. And it means free, fearless speech requiring courage in the face of danger. And that's what he claimed to embody, or it's what he did embody. He called these guys, and remember, these are wealthy, prominent, and almost the entire legislative body of the state of Pennsylvania was taken up by these guys, landowning, wealthy people. He called them the man-stealers and depraved spawns of Satan. Benjamin Rush was one of the founding fathers, and he wrote a biography of Lay, and he called him a Christian philosopher familiar to all in Pennsylvania. I bet he was. So Lay was one of the world's first abolitionists. He wrote a book in 1738 called All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage, Apostates. And he said slave keepers transgress Quakerism, the principles of Quakerism, and the principles of Christianity. And he was really one of the first militant public abolitionists, anti-slavery people who were willing to go in public and make their opposition known. He had no education. When he was born and they saw his disability, they figured, why waste the education? But he was an autodidact. He loved books, and everything he knew he taught himself, and he wrote a number of books. But his book was, his main book about, the spawn of Satan, was oddly written because it was not in the format of somebody who had an education in how to put a book together, somebody who was really, really familiar with the nuts and bolts of the literary arts. This was somebody who had lots of knowledge in his head that he got himself and who pieced it together sort of piecemeal. No one would print his book because in Pennsylvania, all public printing was vetted by the Quaker Board of Overseers because they ran the whole entire state. And Lay went to Benjamin Franklin and told him, would you please publish this? And Benjamin Franklin said, well, yeah, there's a profit to be made here. Of course I will. But Lay told Franklin, put it together any way you want. It was just this haphazard, random writings in a big pile, and Benjamin Franklin had to make some sense out of it, not edit the words, organize it. So Franklin left his own name off of the publication. He didn't want to lose any business. And Lay had what's known as kyphosis, which is a shortness and a hunchback at the same time as the kyphosis. And the book has a little more to say about that. This is his description. His head was large in proportion to his body. The features of his face were remarkable and boldly delineated, and his countenance was grave and benignant. He was hunchbacked with a projecting chest below which his body became much contracted. His legs were so slender as to appear almost unequal to the purpose of supporting him, diminutive as his frame was in comparison with the ordinary size of the human stature. A habit he had contracted of standing in a twisted position with one hand rested upon his left hip added to the effect produced by a large white beard that for many years had not been shaved, contributed to make his figure perfectly unique. His wife Sarah was also what's called a little person. Lay did not lack confidence. He had a ton of confidence, which is one of the things that's really remarkable about him, because he was marginalized from childhood on and ridiculed and belittled and had to fight for anything that he ever was able to achieve. And yet he had no lack of confidence. He called himself the little David against Goliath. Today he's virtually unknown. In his own time he was called crazy. 3 decades after his death, he was described by a French writer, Jacques de Warville, as, quote, all on fire when he spoke on slavery. like 100 years later, was William Lloyd Garrison. In 1808, when slave trade was abolished in England, Lay was credited for awakening the attention of many to the cause, because remember, he lived in England first. He's included in Thomas Clarkson's famous graphic genealogy, a riverine map of abolition. It's like a family tree, but done like a river map. All the branches out. He figures prominently. He was from a poor, obscure background. He was considered a living philosopher in his own time, a citizen of the world. We know him from his book, from Quaker Records, and a record of his guerrilla theater. Lots of interviews of aged Quakers who had known him. And as you're going to come to see, which I think is a lesson for all of us, the children are watching. Because when he did the stunt with the book and the sword and the blood at that Quaker meeting, there were children there that day who, when they grew up, became abolitionists, children of rich landowning slavers, became abolitionists because of Benjamin Lay. He was a free spirit. He was an antinomianist. I hope I said that right. He was against all outward forms of the law. He believed that your conscience should reign supreme. What he was an external anarchist, the word anarchy meaning without a leader, and an internal monarchist. You are the king of your own internal moral compass. He made deep, deep critiques of power in all forms. Let's see here. He combined Quakerism with abolitionism and other radical ideas and practices that were uncommon for his time and rarely thought to be related. Today they are, but not then. Vegetarianism, he was a vegetarian. Animal rights, opposition to the death penalty, environmentalism, and the politics of consumption. He lived in a cave for the last third of his life. He cultivated his own food and made his own clothes. He grew his own flax, spun it into thread, wove it into fabric, and sewed his own clothes. For Benjamin, these beliefs and practices were all part of a consistent, integrated ethical worldview. Ethical worldview. One that could save a planet desperately in need of salvation. He showed that multiple forms and traditions of radicalism could all be part of the same consciousness. He believed that abolition must inform a revolutionary reevaluation of all life, premised on a rejection of the capitalist values of the marketplace. Dr. Harriet Fraud would love this guy. Benjamin Lay was, in several ways, a curiously modern man whose story has never been fully or properly told. He is a radical for his time. Excuse me. He was met with anger and heckling and ridicule. He was called mentally deficient. He was called deranged. He met scorn based on his economic situation, on racism, and on the bias against his disability. He faced almost universally a very hostile response to everything that he said and did. For example, from a guy called Robert Vaux, he used strong words to describe precisely what Benjamin encountered. Opposition, antipathy, prejudice, ridicule, hostility, intolerance, persecution, oppression, and violence. Quote, Benjamin faced vigorous opposition from every quarter and found himself an almost solitary combatant in a field where prejudice and avarice had marshaled their combined forces against him. The responses from his fellow Quakers in particular, the response was so general and so intense it was enough to make a wise man mad, meaning insane, not just angry. Lay was disowned by the Quakers in 1738 for his anti-slavery stand. It took 20 years before slave traders discovered, before the trade of slaving was discovered as being immoral, and they stopped, and 38 years before slave owners stopped. So trade was stopped, so they bred their own slaves, and it's an important distinction. He wasn't allowed to speak at meetings anymore. This didn't stop his campaign. He became more aggressive and more disruptive. He could be self-righteous, as people with a passion and a crusade often are. And he could be intolerant. There's a quote here. This was a quote from Horace. He loved writers of antiquity, and this is a quote about Lay, pointed to Lay, taken from Horace. The just man who is resolute will not be turned from his purpose either by the rage of the crowd or by an imperious tyrant. The courage of your convictions. So this is his life, and it's called A Story of Fearlessness. Chapter 1, his early life. So he was born in 1682 to a third-generation Quaker family in Essex. He had a broad work experience. His family had a broad work experience, and this helped to shape his worldview. He wasn't kind of a provincial person. His grandparents owned a cottage, and they got it in the hearth tax levy. Very interesting little factoid about England at the time. In each village, there were only allowed 22 houses that had hearths, and the hearths were all taxed. The houses were taxed by the fact that they had a hearth. I guess if you were wealthy enough to be able to burn a fire inside your house with a hearth and a chimney, then you were wealthy enough to be taken advantage of for taxes. So Lay's father married his first cousin, and she raised his father's fortunes and elevated his social rank, but the family was not really an educated family. They kind of pulled themselves up. Benjamin was born April of 1682, and he was an autodidact. In the area of the country where he was born, there was textiles and spinning and wool, which makes it more understandable that later he made his own clothes. That's what he knew from the area he was born. Oh, that's what my next sentence is. I must be reading my own mind. He spun and wove his own cloth and sewed his own clothes when he was living in a cave. In Essex is renowned for popular protests. It was a kind of a hotbed of religious radicalism, and that might have also informed his attitudes. Included those who rejected wealth, espoused communal living, and put the Bible into the vernacular. And many had been martyred for that in this area, in the past history of Essex. This is a hotbed of radical thought. Lay's family were at least close friends of dissenters. It's stuff that he was exposed to, these ideas. Quakers were formed by commoners. And remember, in England, they're very class conscious at the time. They were formed by commoners during the English Revolution of the 1640s, with a number of other radical religions. This was considered a radical sect. They wanted to push to establish a godly republic, and they were against avarice, and they were for democracy and equality. And I wrote in the parentheses, this is my own little editorializing, Antifa. They were denounced as antinomians, and those are the ones who didn't think there should be any laws. They had the belief that no one had the right or the power to control human conscience, so they were basically anarchists. Anarchy doesn't mean creating chaos. That's what it's come to be associated with. But the true Greek definition of the words anarchy are without a leader. The Quakers were the epitome of this, very independent. Lay never called himself an antinomian, but he was deeply an antinomian. This was the wellspring of his radicalism. This is the environment, the culture around him. Quakers were a national movement in the 1650s led by a guy called James Naylor from Yorkshire and a guy called George Fox. And quaking was their visible appearance of what they were doing when they were transfixed religiously. They joined with other sects against the Church of England, and they shouted down ministers. That should sound familiar. They refused to pay tithes, which is really, I mean, that was where it really hit them where they hurt. Quakers believed that each person contains a divine inner light, a light of God, and they were quite anti-clerical. They had no ministry. They didn't need to have a minister intercede between them and God because everyone has God inside. And their big law was do not obey wicked laws. Civil disobedience, right? They often allied with what were called ranters. I probably would have been a ranter. And the quote is, "To the pure of heart, all things were pure." Several were incarcerated. Some died in jail because of terrible conditions. And there were three principal characteristics of early Quakerism. The first was they did public rants, and they were against an established ministry. They believed it was their duty to, channel prophecy, to have that knowledge from the light within. The second was the refusal of hat honor. That's a great term, hat honor. It was required in England at the time that people of lower status were legally required to remove their hat to higher status people that they saw. And they had to also remove it for the king. And Quakers refused to do that. I think that's why they're always pictured, they always wear their hats, because it comes from this hat honor thing. That's so funny. And the third principle of Quakerism was provocative street theater. Now, I never before thought of Quakers as being engaged in public displays of anti-anything. I kind of envisioned somebody quiet and demure and sort of holding back in public. So this was a surprise to me. They often, these Quakers in England, disrupted their services, the religious services, and they suffered serious persecution because of it. And they felt that this persecution was a sign of God's favor on them. They would heckle ministers, and it became so frequent that Oliver Cromwell passed a law against it, and hundreds of them were imprisoned for shouting out in church. Benjamin often spoke truth to power. He came from a proud history of it and was jailed on occasion for it. He refused to doff his hat, and of course, this was seen as a social breach and an attempt to assert equality in status. And he didn't like that, the powers that be. Some Quakers wouldn't remove their hats to pray because God is within us all. Or as I told my mother one Sunday when she wasn't happy with what I put on to go to Mass, what does it matter? God has seen me naked. You can imagine the response I got. So the Quaker Church was considered a congregation of godly people anywhere. It's how they looked at their church. Any godly people that got together, and not a physical building, which is why they don't call it a church. They call it a meeting, because the church is inside of you. The meeting is what you do when you all get together to talk. They often performed eccentric acts. These are original Quakers in England. Going naked for a sign. They'd wander around the streets naked. Or burning a Bible to emphasize the inward light of God inside everybody. Let's see here. What did I want to read to you? One Quaker came naked through Westminster Hall, only very civilly tied about the privates to avoid scandal, and with a chafing dish of fire and brimstone upon his head did pass through the hall, crying, "Repent, repent." Women often playing leading roles in these apocalyptic dramas. The most famous piece of guerrilla theater, Quaker guerrilla theater, featured James Naylor, who, surrounded by Martha Simmons and other Quaker women singing hosannas and laying flowers in his path, reenacted Christ's entry into Jerusalem by riding into Bristol on a donkey in October of 1656. Naylor was, at the time, the leading writer and theologian among Quakers, a co-leader with Fox of a rapidly growing, deeply subversive movement. When questioned by magistrates, the woman, Simmons, gave an antinomian explanation of her actions. She acted, quote, in obedience to the power on high. So they took the opportunity, Parliament did, to break the Quaker insurgency. They had a 12-session debate. They condemned Naylor to 3 floggings, a bored tongue. They poked a hole in his tongue, a branding of the letter B for blasphemer on his forehead, and incarceration, a savage set of punishments for which he never recovered. I'm not surprised. After the flogging, it said he had no skin left between his hips and his shoulders. He left prison a broken man in 1659 and died a year later. Before antibiotics, too. Remember that. So George Fox then tried to tame the free spirits, try to calm things down so they all didn't end up getting incarcerated. And he happened at the same time, all of this, as the restoration of Charles II and the reign of terror against revolutionaries. So, bad timing. In 1660, Fox made a peace testimony. This is what we referred to earlier, which was shrewdly done politically to avoid political retribution. He also, for the first time in the Quaker religion, established a hierarchy. This was a system of permission that you needed before beginning a new Quaker ministry. And it, of course, what's the first thing they did is knock women out of the running for the hierarchy. The original Quakers had been democratic. Now they became rigid, authoritarian, and catechetical. I can't say it. Into catechism, into an outline of what you will believe and what you won't believe. Fox won this whole thing. He changed the boisterous revolutionary movement into a disciplined sect. Benjamin, 2 generations later from all of this, was more like the original Quakers, very, very original ones, and he wanted to restore the egalitarian order of the very first ones. He kept his hat on, he did street theater, he loved the apocalyptic book of Revelation. He was called mad by fellow Quakers, but he was just exactly like the original founders who were martyred or shut up. His worldview was radical Quakerism. In the late 1690s, as a teen, he went to Fordham and became a shepherd. And he loved the gentleness of the sheep. So this is a guy who actually had a number of life experiences beyond his small community. He saw ministers who were slave owners, and he regarded them as wolves in sheep's clothing. The Quakers saw themselves in what was called the Lamb's War, a fight between the satanic forces from the book of Revelation. So they viewed their purpose in life, or their mission in life, was to be the good side of this Lamb's War, the innocent and the good against the satanic forces, the evil. After being a shepherd for a while, he went to Colchester and became an apprentice to a glove maker, a glover. And this was called one of the stinking trades because it dealt in the skins of dead animals. It didn't require strength, and it didn't require a lot of ingenuity. It was a pretty rote job, and small hands helped to be able to do the fine work, and so lots of children and women were in it. It was called a sedentary stooping business, so I'm sure it probably didn't pay well. Lay didn't like it, and at the age of 21 in 1703, he ran away to the city of London to become, the unlikeliest of things, a sailor. And he eventually returned to making gloves, but he did quit. He didn't like it. This affected his later rejection of any animals against violence against animals. He became an animal rights advocate way before that was even a thing. He wanted to see the world, which is why he became a sailor, and he stood to inherit the family farm, and he kind of rejected that and left and went to London to go to sea. So there was the Great Storm of 1703, and this is right before he became a sailor. There was an 80-mile-per-hour cyclone which sank dozens of ships in the Thames, in the waterfront. 10,000 sailors died in the Thames, or the harbor, whatever. There was extreme damage to all the shipping. And, of course, it was interpreted as the wrath of God because the ship's captains were tyrannical to their crews and very greedy. So it was really good timing on Lay's part. He showed up right after that. They desperately needed sailors, so they took him. The deep-sea sailing ship at the time was the most advanced, consequential machine of its day, and it helped create empires. On board, life was multi-ethnic and collective, and he fit in very well. He soaked up cosmopolitan knowledge available to sailors, and the rest of his life he referred to himself as a sailor. He got to see the world and participate in things he would never have been able to be exposed to in England. On his deathbed, he asked to have his ashes scattered at sea, which was considered shocking at the time. Cremation. He took the opportunity to jump ship and explore biblical lands. He drew conclusions that male and female are all one in Christ the truth. This guy, he's an enlightened being. He had a strong belief in gender equity, another unusual thing for his time. He used seafaring to his advantage. He needed a certificate from the Quakers to get married. And he was, as the book puts it very politely, not in local favor. So he sailed to Salem, Massachusetts, where they didn't know him. And he got a certificate from the Quakers in Massachusetts, and then took the opportunity to go on a rant publicly against Cotton Mather. Their Mathers were sticks in the mud. And then he sailed back to London and got married because he had his certificate. He spent life moving away from authoritarians and trying to suppress his radicalism, but it was just part of his nature. He traveled by foot because he did not agree with the exploitation of horses. On a sailing ship, he met 4 men who had been slaves in Turkey. And he later heard stories of African slave trades from people who had suffered through it, including many stories that other white people didn't hear at the time of rape that happened on board ships. So these are his words. I want to be really clear for the purposes of YouTube. I'm quoting a man from the early 1700s. 4 men enslaved in Turkey were not as badly used by Muslims as the poor Negroes are by some called Christians. So that was a pretty strong statement to make at the time. In fact, wouldn't be real popular now either. There's a biblical passage that he liked. Let's see if I can find it. From Acts 17:26. And this passage from the Bible would become the centerpiece of the abolitionist movement. God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. And Benjamin took this to heart, the spiritual equity of all humankind, saying confidently to his fellow Quakers that God did not make others to be slaves to us. It was very clear to him. He makes it so clear, so basically simple that, how can you argue, right? Not that we would want to, but how could the people of the time not see the moral clarity? Lay did not believe in race. Now, this was very controversial then because that was how society was being divided up, with Africans brought here against their will at the bottom, poor white people therefore provided with somebody below them, and then separated from the landed gentry and the big shots at the top. And the color of your skin had a lot to do with where you landed in that hierarchy. He believed people are all of one blood. He completely avoided racist language. And the only people that he called barbaric were the slavers. He saw and spoke of equality and the sameness of the enslaver and the slave. Sailors formed a sort of labor union, and Lay was a champion of labor and of workers. Another thing unusual for his time. He linked seafaring and slavery back to the Bible, to a quote from Jeremiah: "Woe unto him that buildeth his house by iniquity, and useth his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work." He called slavers murderers in the same way that Engels called factory owners guilty of social murder 100 years later. He saw slavers who believed themselves above the law and all moral sense and believed they were murderers. He was one of the first to condemn the maritime holocaust of Atlantic slave trading. Chapter 2, a man of strife and contention. After being a sailor, he dedicated himself to ending false ministers and slavers, and he had repeated conflicts with established Quakers. He believed covetousness was destroying Quakerism and the world. Very anti-materialist. The first real proof of his Quakerism was in 1718 in Boston. He was in trouble with the Quakers of London, and remember, he wanted to get a certificate to get married. And they sent a letter to Salem warning that Lay made trouble because he was convinced that he knew the truth. And later he became referred to as the Quaker Comet. London told people in Massachusetts that he was trouble and wanted to marry Sarah in England, who had the same afflictions and was also the type to preach at meetings. It's assumed that they probably met at a meeting house. So the people in London, the Quakers in London, tried to prevent him from getting his certificate for marriage. He attended a variety of meetings looking for a pure church, and he stirred up trouble in most of the churches he went to. He told a famous speaker to sit down and called him a hypocrite. This is great. Just dying to have seen all this. He got into serious trouble when he confronted two public friends. This is approved ministers during a worship service, and he didn't like their preaching. The Holy Spirit was not in them. They were preaching their own words, not God's truth. So he bid them to be silent and sit down, adding for good measure that Price, one of them, was a hypocrite. He later described the kind of preaching he objected to. Many are grown restless and uneasy and sitting in silence. I guess it used to be that they sat in silence. Now all of a sudden they were all these bombastic guys full of hot air make speechifying. And he said as people are not comfortable just sitting in quiet with themselves. Those who had a strong opinion of their own performance and a rich conceit of the great good they do started speaking, hammering, and tampering. They went to work with noise of words and oftentimes no sense. Conceit was vanity, and silence, so crucial to Quaker worship, was being disrespected, so Benjamin took it upon himself to enforce old tradition. The leaders of this meeting house disapproved. They appointed 3 friends to speak with Benjamin tenderly about his outburst and to encourage him to come to a sense of his offense. The meeting officially condemned his acts and required that he affirm the condemnation in order to be reinstated. He refused to say that he was guilty. They withheld his marriage certificate, but he fought it enough where they just gave it to him to get rid of him. And he sailed for Barbados. 1718 to 1720, this was the first cradle of Quakerism in America, in the Americas. It was also the leading slave area of the world, the crown jewel of England's empire. Slavery defined the island. There was a master class, and then there was a terrorized African population forced to do 18 hours of labor. They died quickly. Sugarcane work is the most dangerous in the world, and I think it still is. They were overworked to death. The quote from the time is, "If a slave lived a year, he pays for himself." So we have here a poem. The planters were as a class unjust in their words and dealings one to the other, horrible, profane, and rude in their discourse and conversation. They possessed no moral code, no proper religion. They thought of God only in their curses and blasphemies. They took better care of their horses than the workers on whom they depended. So this man, who was an early abolitionist, wrote an acrostic upon the island of Barbados and ye inhabitants thereof. So an acrostic is, he writes the word Barbados in vertical form, and then the B is the first letter of the first sentence of the poem, and then B, I can't spell, my R, B. So the word is spelled out, and each letter of the word is used to initiate a line of the poem. Barbados Isle inhabited by slaves, and for one honest man 10,000 knaves. Religion to these a romantic story, barbarity and ill-got wealth thy glory. All Sodom's sins are centered in thy heart. Death is thy look and death in every part. O glorious isle, in villainy excel. Sin to the height, thy fate is hell. It's great. We used to make those in grade school from Merry Christmas, or Easter, or whatever. Anyway, called it a land of barbarity and ill-got wealth. They met and spoke with and listened to the slaves, he and his wife, which was not common for white people to even care. He held meetings and served meals, and hundreds of slaves came, and he got their stories. The white population wanted to banish them because they were troublemakers stirring up the slaves, and they already had planned to leave for fear of becoming desensitized. That's interesting. He called what he saw in Barbados the worst trauma that haunted the rest of his life. Next, they went to London from 1720 to 1722. And in a month after getting there, he was in trouble again for speaking out against a Quaker preacher. He was written up by the meeting and read publicly to shame him. It didn't work because he wouldn't admit he'd done anything wrong because he felt what he said was justified. He was kicked out, and 2 months later, he and his wife tried again, and he tossed the article drawn up against him out the window. He kept going to meetings and speaking out, and had to move to Colchester and get away from London. Between 1722 and 1726, Colchester had been invaded in the past, in antiquity, by the Romans, the Saxons, the Danes, the Normans, and enthusiasts. He became a glover again and didn't register as a free man, which was the term meant for foreign to the area. There were only 500 Quakers in the area, and that number went down. He verbally attacked one local minister after another. The London Committee said that he was in a dark, disordered condition. And we therefore, this is what the committee is saying, in concurrence with our Friends of Devonshire House monthly meeting, where he'd already been kicked out, to signify our great dislike to and dissatisfaction with his irregular, disorderly, and evil practices, tending to confusions as well as at London, as amongst us, wherefore we can have no unity with him until he has given you friends of a monthly meeting of Devonshire House satisfaction for his offense during the time of his residence in London, and afterwards gives this meeting satisfaction also. So they wanted him to, back off, humiliate himself, and say he had been wrong. Didn't feel he'd been wrong morally. They next joined a meeting made of men and women from scattered villages, odds and ends of people. The women embraced Sarah, but cooperation between the two closest meetings fell apart, and there then was no cooperation until the year 1759, when Lay died that year. So it took a very long time for these groups to work cohesively. He was barred from business meetings held amongst the Quakers, but the worship meetings were open to all. They couldn't keep him out. Things against him got so hot that London notified all meetings, take off your hat. They started dictating what the people were going to do, doff your hat, and Lay refused, and that really set the stage. He escalated by attending all the women's meetings and causing disturbances in the women's meetings, and which I think is interesting. They were separated, and they actually formed a 3-person security team to keep him out, especially assigned 3 big guys went to every meeting to be there in case he showed up to carry him out. This issue of Lay and his troublemaking went back and forth, up and down the hierarchy, with him refusing to cooperate and speaking out against everybody. It was epic. It was great. He objected to the governance of men of wealth. He didn't like the social evolution of groups to become the prosperous and the bourgeois and then the rabble. He was an antinomian. He attacked those he called the covetous, the rich. He struggled with refusing to admit anything, and he kept arguing in meetings, and he kept his hat on, and he kept refusing to admit that he'd done anything wrong. He also disturbed churches all over town. He went to the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, stood up and called them sinners. He was taken to court for, quote, depraving the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. So, he interrupted communion, I guess. He refused to assure that he would show up for trial. He refused to be released on his own recognizance. He was just completely uncooperative. He was jailed, and while still contending with the Quakers and not happy with the letter from them about him, So at this point in the chronology, there's no record of him and his wife Sarah for 3.5 years. So did they withdraw intentionally for a while from meetings? Were they threatened? I mean, what happened? In 1729, Sarah wrote, and this is one little inkling of what might have happened, that Lay, quote, stood at a distance from friends. So he was maybe really frustrated and avoiding them. They decided that they would move to Philadelphia, but they needed reinstatement with the Quakers to be able to get a certificate to join the Philadelphia Quaker meeting. I guess you just couldn't wander in off the street. There was a lot of formality, a lot of control. Meanwhile, one meeting relented out of pity for his wife because she was less confrontational than he was. And they gave them a travel certificate, and I'm assuming this is a Quaker thing, and they sailed to Philadelphia where there were 2 meetings, and immediately people were angry with him and tried to disavow him. I think I'm going to stop here because it's the end of the chapter, and this would be a good place to stop video number 1. And I'll be back with video number 2. And I hope you're enjoying this. I'm telling you, you can picture this, a movie. This is such a stirring story. He's such an individual, such a committed character, just a great guy. I'm loving looking at this again. It's been a while since I read the book, so it's great. I'll be back. Thank you for watching.